podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and I just want to say at the start of the show, my dog is depressed. Have you ever experienced this? Where your dog is just, it's bad enough. I have teenagers who sometimes, sigh and throw themselves down on the couch in some form of exasperation. Or if you ask them how their day is, and like, it was fine. Blah, blah, blah. Even if things are great, they had a good day, so it's okay, right? Well, I got this dog. Now, my dog is a sickly dog. She's a rescue from Tennessee. I think I mentioned this before, maybe not, but, she's a rescue from a hoarder's home. So she had been separated in this hoarder's home from what we would assume to have been her biological family. And when they found her and what they marked down as far as like her breed doesn't really match up with anything, honestly. So we think what happened was she'd gotten separated, was found with another batch of dogs. Cause again, it was this messy house and puppies were found everywhere in different locations and whatever. So she was born with like a form of genetic mites, which are different than catching the mites, the domomysodetric mites, whatever it is. She's allergic to grass. How do you have a dog that's allergic to grass? And she gets frequent, inflammation. And then on top of it all, when she starts to have like medication routinely, she starts to get moody. She gets super moody. And I come home tonight and she's like, hi, and then she just goes upstairs and like lies down in her bed and like side eyes me like, what? I can't even. Now, I'm not making light of depression. I'm not making light of dog depression. I just can't believe that I have this like depressed dog who then, in a couple of weeks, if we're just constantly playing with her, constantly paying attention, constantly, then she's good, But she'll go through these phases, particularly when she's not feeling well, where she's just like a big lump, a teenager. It's exactly what she reminds me of. Mind you, our old house, while the house itself was much smaller, or have my kids, as they have informed me, now a few years removed from living there, that they found our old house to often be, at least my daughter in particular, scary. Now, I had no idea that this was the case, particularly in our basement. Okay, here's a quick segue. I got to tell you the basement story. So we had our house flooded out, right? So I was doing another podcast. I mentioned that briefly before on the show. I was doing a pro wrestling podcast, and where I recorded was the basement because it's a single story ranch, except for we had this, furnished basement, which was great. Layout was weird. It was dark, dank. It did not have sheetrock walls. It had plywood walls. Everything was done by the prior owners on the cheap, which is fine. It certainly met all the requirements that you could possibly want and maximize the amount of square footage that you had in this little ranch. So in the basement, there's one thing that I swear was not there when we moved in, and there was a name in what looked to be chalk on this one brick in the basement. Now, bear in mind, this is the oddest fireplace that I've ever seen in my entire life, because the entire half of the wall was brick, like horizontally. Like it was a weird, long, narrow basement, like mimicking the ranch. So it was like, I think 27 feet or something like that, all the way down, right? Lengthwise. And this was like 12, 13, 14 feet of just brick, like horizontally. Most of the time you have like a mantle and it's built vertically. And on one of these bricks, it says Linda. Okay. So You're like, where are you going with this story? I don't know. I'm just going to hear me out. So I was doing some work in the backyard, and we had been talking about, we were there for like 10 years or something like that. And there's this one piece of the yard, and we didn't really have like a big deck back there. It was more that we, created space and like outdoor rugs and like picnic tables and stuff like that. So anyway, we were considering doing some actual work, and I was just kind of digging in the area under the carpet, under the outdoor rug, and I was going to smooth it out, whatever. And I was doing some digging, just some kind of research. Okay, what's under here? What do we got to deal with? And I end up hitting something really hard and long. Right? Like, what are you getting at? So it's right in the same spot. Right in the same spot. On the other side of the wall where it said Linda. I didn't put two and two together, right? I didn't think of anything. In fact, maybe I should, I don't know, have someone go and look. But nevertheless, I'm like, okay, that's weird. It's probably just rock, or maybe there was another foundation, or maybe there was a deck there at some point in the past, because the house was built in 1968. So when our basement flooded out, got completely wiped out, we discovered a few things. So one, underneath the carpet that was down there, and it was just a very simple kind of industrial carpet, right? Nothing fancy. And when we have to pull it up because of this flood, our irrigation system blew out and all cascaded into our basement, basically. Probably about calf high water. Not what you want in your basement. And when they pulled up the rug, we found that there's tile under there. Of course, asbestos tile. But what appeared to be in the middle of this room, a compass rose, or at least we thought it was a compass rose. God knows what else it might have been. So bear in mind, I just mentioned to you that my kids find this whole thing, this whole basement, they've always found it creepy. Excuse me. Now, I too would on occasion find that basement a little creepy. Okay. Honestly, the only word that can be described is sometimes there were some vibes. There were some vibes in there. And the kids never liked to be down there. Like, very rarely would anyone go down there by themselves to watch a show or a movie or whatever, right? There's always had to be together, or at least two. Very rarely is someone going to stay down there very long by themselves, even in the daytime, honestly, right? They weren't feeling it. So we have to then gut the entire basement, right? So part of it was, I'm like, okay, well, if we're gutting the whole thing, then we're redoing everything. And that includes what had been surface-mounted ceiling tiles, right? Just right up against the joists. And whenever you had to replace them because of, maybe water penetration, whatever it is, it was always a pain. You had to line up the tiles, and, a surface mount is difficult to make significant changes. So we're going to yank down the basement too. So we were bringing it down to studs and nothing else. Thankfully, the insurance paid for a lot of the initial gutting and all that, and actually reimbursed us for materials because we ended up hitting COVID. So we had to do the work ourselves, which I think I mentioned on one of the episodes, probably the anniversary episode. So as I am pulling down the tiles from the ceiling, two things end up dropping from the ceiling. Two things drop from the ceiling. And they're books. Okay. So I'm like, oh, okay. This is odd. And I pick up the books and I pick them up. I start to read them, and they are hardcore BDSM books. Hardcore. And I'm like, what is this? So now here's the next piece. Whether real or imagined, whether from the material that it appeared to be, or whether it had just been paint or wood stain, there was clearly what appeared to be, in my opinion, bloody handprints as I'm removing more sections of this ceiling. So we have this weird tile with what we think is a compass rose, maybe. This weird overbuilt fireplace with all of this brick with a name scrawled in chalk that I don't believe was there when we first moved in. And this weird concrete something in the backyard. So it is possible that there is someone named Linda buried in the backyard of that house. I don't know what to say. You know, just the point is of this whole story is that while our last house was not as enjoyable for my children, the one thing we all agreed upon was even though our yard in our new house is quite large, we have a fair bit of land. Not going to complain. Very, very privileged in that regard. We found a deal and a steal at a time before the market went crazy. But that other backyard, while smaller, was completely fenced in, and we didn't have to go crazy with fencing because neighbors on 3 sides had fencing. And we kind of connected everything together because it was just, cost effective and reasonable, and it was great. So the dog had a lot of free reign back there that she doesn't have now because she has to be kind of contained and she's on a lead a lot of the time. Like if she wants to just go outside and hang, not go for a walk, she just wants to go out and hang out in the sun, she goes on a lead and she heads out, right? Well, that's, I think, part of her problem. And we keep going. We don't have the money right now to put in a fence in this huge backyard. But my gosh, everyone needs a little exercise. And if we put a little doggy door out there, she would be in and out all day, having a blast. And I think that would increase her mood. So here are the takeaways from this initial set of anecdotes. 1, I have a depressed dog who just needs to exercise. And B, there might be a lady who was, potentially, BDSM to death, buried in the backyard. Crazy. I remember when I hit that, I think one of my sons was outside with me as I'm digging, and I go, clank, clank. It's like, what's that? I'm like, I don't know, buddy. I'm sure it's probably just some slate or something from a patio that used to be there before. Anyway, I don't know. You tell me. Should I be placing a call to the new owners and saying, you might want to dig in the backyard? I don't know. Maybe find something. Because what we did when we redid the basement, which ended up being like a focal point for our sale, like it increased our value tremendously. And like I said, I did all the sheetrock. I reframed it. Like one wall, I reframed. I relocated a door, like a bunch of stuff I'd never done before. Only thing we really had done was the mudding and the taping and a drop ceiling put in. Everything else we did. New baseboards. We had the floor done too. So I guess I just did sheetrock, painting, a lot of the demo. I redid all the lights, put in all new canister lighting throughout before the lighting was abysmal. And, we got a couple of months out of it where no one really complained much about being down in the basement. So I'm wondering if maybe through the process of redoing the basement, we released whatever bad juju was down there. And, everyone's at peace now. Which reminds me, I've talked about a whole bunch of projects that I'm working on. One of them does involve some spooky things. And October is right around the corner. Hoping to pull something really cool off. So those of you who listen to the podcast who might be interested in a live stream, I might have a live stream coming up pretty soon. It all is all going to depend on timing. Excuse me. And I'm after weeks of not really coughing very much, I'm starting to get a cold again. Ridiculous because everyone's back at school, and that's what happens. So keep an eye out on some potential new projects coming very, very soon. This one is closer to fruition than some of the others, and I'm kind of stoked. If I can pull this off, it'd be wicked cool. Anyway, so how y'all doing? Let's get into the meat and potatoes of the evening. So it seems to me that from what I can tell on statistics and numbers, certain things track better than others, and interests tend to be varied. And I'm always curious about what pops. So it's very interesting. Episodes that I don't think are going to do great do really well, and vice versa. So this one's a little different. So I was initially thinking about pinups and beefcakes, if you will. Pinups and hunks, babes and hunks, and all the sex symbols of the 70s and the 80s. And I started to go down that road. But what was kind of curious about it is, and this will be another episode, it's still going to get there, but, the objectification of human beings by other human beings, both male and female, is remarkable. And how there tends to be such an amazing amount of bias that goes into all of this. And when it's appropriate, when it isn't, that's a little arbitrary, frankly. So it's like words like sexiest and hottest and yeah. So I thought, let's go a little bit more cerebral, shall we? Yes, we're going to go with something very cerebral. Not that cerebral. Nothing. I'm never going to be that cerebral. That's not the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is some reminiscence, some nostalgia, some fun, some pop culture, some trivia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a big sip of this water here in my generic Stanley. And let's see if I can get through this without any more major coughing fits. So what I'm talking about this week is Time's Person of the Year, 1980s edition. That's right. We're going to go through all the people of the year from Time Magazine. Still doing this every year. And we're not going to tread terribly far into opinions of people. It's more just thinking about them from why it made sense that you would have this person or that person, really depending on where you are in history, right? So let's just get into it. 1980, I don't think it comes as any surprise that the person of the year was President Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California. So he was elected, of course, in November of 1979. Or was it? Wait, is that how it works? Yeah, right? He's elected. No, so the election was 1980. He was sworn in 1981. So, so for 1980, he was elected president of the United States, defeating incumbent Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter, so again, this is I don't like to get too much into my own opinions on socio-political topics. I delve into it here and there. In general, when we're talking about things like presidents, in my opinion, you're going to have good and bad in every elected person. Really. And oftentimes it becomes personality, just where your own proclivities are, or significant events that are going to shape your view of that person positively or negatively. So frankly, the people who voted for Jimmy Carter the first time did not stick with Jimmy Carter, and that's because of not likability, right? It was you had significant events. And if you look at the person of the year for 1979, it was the Ayatollah Khomeini. So that in of itself kind of gives you a glimpse, glance and glimpse gets you glimpse, kind of what led to Reagan's election and how Jimmy Carter had kind of lost some steam, particularly on the international front. So now we have 1981. I will be honest, I am ignorant of many things in world politics, and also I was little at the time. Excuse me. We have, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Lech Walesa, who was the leader of the Polish Solidarity Trade Union and architect of the Gdansk Agreement. Now, the reason I'm saying things like that is because I kept listening to the pronunciation key, and it's in a computerized voice, and it's like Gdansk. But he was architect of the Gdansk Agreement until his arrest by the communist authorities and the imposition of martial law in Poland in December of 1981. So bear in mind, it has been theorized or talked about with Lech Walesa that because of what he was doing from the union perspective, it actually helped to bring down communism in Poland. It's just that he had to go through this initial period, right? So the martial law in Poland, which ran from, 1981 to 1983. Oh, sorry, guys. It's back. Yes, I'm still smoking, so it's my own fucking fault. Anyway, 1 year, 7 months, 1 week, and 2 days. So Poland was in a deep recession, and Edward Gierek, the first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, had obtained a series of large loans from foreign creditors to achieve better economic output, but they instead resulted in a domestic crisis. So it's always going to be about economies, no matter what it is, whether it is war, pandemics, labor issues. Like, it's always about economics. It is. And we kind of have a lot of stuff happening right now in the world, particularly amongst labor unions, conflict worldwide, wars being waged. It's just like, good grief. So anyway, Lech Walesa mangled that. So 1982, so they can just change it whenever they want. The editors of Time magazine will sometimes say, well, we're not going to talk about a person. What we're going to talk about is Machine of the Year, which is the computer. But they had a feature, spotlight about the computer that did include actual people. I think you will be fascinated to see who's not on the list. So in the computer article, they have Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, John Opel, president and CEO of IBM, Adam Osborne, founder of Osborne Computer Corporation, Dan Bricklin, co-creator of VisiCalc, Jack Tramiel, founder of Commodore International, and Clive Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Research. Now, I'm sure some of you techies know more of those names than I do. I know John Opel, and I know Steve Jobs. I know Commodore International. I just didn't know Jack Tramiel. Born Idek Trezmel in Poland in 1928. Nevertheless, he started out with the Commodore portable typewriter, which became Commodore Business Machines. One of my first computers was a Commodore 64, or was it the VIC-20, different company? What was the VIC-20? Hold on. VIC-20, also Commodore. All right. So, 1983, we once again have Ronald Reagan. And this time, because Reagan, so again, time is similar to what I'm talking about, where they're not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing. They're just looking at impact, right? So someone could do something horrible. So let's go back in time for a moment, shall we? Let's go back to 1938. 1938, the person of the year was Adolf Hitler. In 1939, it was Joseph Stalin. I mean, what more do you need to know, right? Unsurprisingly, in subsequent years, you have people like George C. Marshall, Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Winston Churchill. But, again, those two names that I mentioned, leader of the Nazi Party and leader of the Communist Party of Russia, Hitler and Stalin are not what we would call heroic. I mean, I guess to some people they would be, but those people are awful. So, back to the list. But during that time, Reagan ordered the invasion of Grenada and championed the Strategic Defense Initiative, which, of course, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is nicknamed Star Wars, also became a big part of mutually assured destruction, right? So it's basically Russia and the United States saying, hey, you shoot me, we shoot you, it's all over. World dies. I guess to some extent, it's worked. I only say it's worked because we haven't had a nuclear war that's destroyed all of us as of yet. I mean, let's be honest, the United States has the one very infamous claim to fame, and we used the bomb. We've used it. And I think that everyone saw the destructive power of it and would rather not go down that road again, which makes sense to me, particularly on that scale. So now, also in 1983, we had Yuri Andropov, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party, who was a critic of the Strategic Defense Initiative and was trying to revive the stagnating Soviet economy. Now, he was hospitalized in 83 and actually died in 84, so right after this. Let's see. He had passed away at the age of 69. Nice. Now, the next gentleman. So, much like presidents, you have businessmen who, depending on your perspective, or even depending on legitimately like what they do right or do wrong, you can have someone who is adored by many, loathed by others. I think that's life. I think it's in any walk of life, no matter how big or small. But Peter Ueberroth. So he was best known as the organizer of the 1984 Summer Olympics, which, of course, the Soviets had boycotted. Oh, it's back. Makes me so crabby. So I apologize. I'm trying not to once again do a ton of editing, so I'm leaving this in. So I apologize that you heard that much bigger cough than some of the other ones, but let's just keep plugging away. So anyway, Peter Ueberroth. The Soviets are boycotting, kind of getting back at us for boycotting earlier games. And this guy comes in and not only revitalizes LA as part of this process, but is the first one to have ever made a profit, a surplus for the Olympic Committee. So not only did they cover all the costs that were needed for LA to host the games, $225 million surplus, which was then basically the early phase of having Olympic athletes fully sponsored. So the Olympic Committee for the United States of America was now pooling resources because they had this huge kind of seed money in order to go ahead and provide maximum resources for these oftentimes student athletes, because they couldn't have sponsorships. They really couldn't do anything other than train for the Olympics. However, Ueberroth was also the commissioner of Major League Baseball. Now, on the one hand, some would say that he did great stuff for baseball. He was able to minimize the impact of an umpire strike, minimize the impact of a player strike within really short time periods. And not only did attendance grow every single year that he was commissioner, almost every single team, who at the time, many teams were failing when he became commissioner, almost every team broke even or turned a profit. The first multi-billion-dollar TV rights deal, really great stuff, right? Was also implicated in an owner's collusion scandal where basically, and think about this, when he was doing the Olympics, right, it was about national pride, and you're competing against all these, athletes from around the world. Major League Baseball, on the other hand, is much more insulated, much more insular, because it's right here. Hey, this is everyone. So his mindset of profit, profit, profit being ultimately the most important thing led him to say to the owners in one of his very first meetings, hey, you guys are stupid. You guys are dumb because I don't understand why you're wasting your money trying to win the World Series when your focus should be trying to maximize profits. Think about that. I can imagine someone like George Steinbrenner, and just probably what led George Steinbrenner to like then throw everything but the kitchen sink at winning. Because why wouldn't you? Oh, all these other schmucks are just going to take the money. I'm going to take the money and I'm going to just build and continue to build upon this dynasty. So yeah, he wasn't particularly liked by players because I guess in the time that he was in charge and kind of colluding, basically like early free agents and people who were expecting either max deals or match deals from their existing clubs, etc., found themselves getting way less than they were anticipating getting. And that's because of him working with owners saying, don't throw all your money at players. It's stupid. So next, 1985, Deng Xiaoping, who is the paramount leader of China. What great names. Paramount leader. That's badass. Deng was acknowledged for the need for sweeping economic reforms that have challenged Marxist orthodoxies. In 1985, Deng had lifted price controls and eased the restrictions on private ownership and business. So what's interesting about that is that this happened in 1985. So obviously in post-war Germany, you had East Germany, West Germany, and, the Allied powers were, basically occupying. Was it East Germany? Anyway. One of the things they were finding is they couldn't get the German economy kickstarted. Part of the reason being was the Allies were basically imposing price controls. That is going to stagnate businesses. And you look at it from the perspective of a communist nation where your economy, government, everything is all mixed in. It was, no, bread is a fixed price of X, right? Juice is a fixed price of Y. And doesn't really do much when you're trying to be competitive in a global market. So some have said that the reason that China became a global superpower from a GDP perspective was because of his reforms. So here we have Deng Xiaoping, 1985's Person of the Year. Now, this next person is a story of tragedy and triumph. And I just remember hearing her name the first time. So this is 1986. Corazon Aquino. So imagine your husband, right, is basically, no, I'm sorry. No. Do I have that right? Yeah. Oh, nickname versus real name. Benigno, Ninoy Aquino Jr. was her husband. He's known as Ninoy. Was assassinated for being a critic of everyone's favorite Filipino dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. Remember that name? Remember Imelda Marcos and her amazing shoe collection while the people suffered? Well, Aquino ended up becoming a challenger. She's like, killed my husband, but you know what? This is the people power revolution. And became the elected president of the Philippines in 1986. In what was popularly known, by the way, as a snap election. Right? A snap election is one that's called earlier than the actual, oh gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Excuse me. Term. Before that term is completed. Now, Marcos kind of knew from health issues that he was having and obviously the public approval issues, he'd basically lost any kind of allies, particularly with countries like the U.S., who kind of, let him do his dictatorial thing. Like he was initially democratically elected. and then gradually began to take on more and more power. But then once he declared martial law, some of the world leaders are kind of like, yeah, dude, you've kind of gone too far and really backed away from Marcos as a leader, because now he'd crossed the line. Anyway, Corazon Aquino, she becomes president, and she was in office from 1986 to 1992, the 11th president of the Philippines. Yeah, kind of an amazing story, you know? Yeah, her husband was 50 years old and assassinated really he was on the tarmac the first time he was heading back to the Philippines after, I guess, 3 years out of the country. Somewhere in that time, he had been targeted because he was an opponent of Marcos. So we mentioned a little earlier Yuri Andropov, who had wanted to revive a stagnating Soviet economy. Now, that's back in 83. Here we are in 1987, and the person of the year is Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, talked a bunch about Mikhail Gorbachev, and you want to go check out the Cold War episode in the archives in Stuck in the Middle podcast. But as a general secretary of the Communist Party, Gorbachev, of course, oversaw perestroika and glasnost. And perestroika, of course, was meant to be an opening up of the society and business and, it's political reform, but also glasnost, which was meaning, transparency, or as much as you were going to be in Soviet Russia, right? Now, perestroika is literally called restructuring. So it's a restructuring in order to go ahead and get rid of what had been a continuing era of stagnation. I mean, based upon this, it's saying that the era of stagnation really started in about 1964 and running through about 1985. And looking at it as because of certain policies that were put in place with prior leaders. So anyway, Mikhail Gorbachev, ultimately, it was he, along with President Reagan, who kind of changed, at least for a period of time, changed the world and a normalization of, relations between the two world superpowers. Now in 1988, my freshman year of high school. And it's just, again, I'm not passing any particular, judgment one way or another, because I think it's become a political issue. And I think at the time when this was written, it was very earnest and very honest. And I think it was for the right reasons. And then, like anything else, once people find a way to make money, they're going to jump on it. I said economy, finance, it's what it's all about. Anyway, the person of the year was, in fact, not a person, but the planet of the year. And that was the endangered Earth. Planet of the year, representing the growing environmental movement, as well as several natural and ecological disasters that struck in 1988. And then this is the one where I read it and it hit me and I went, oh my gosh, I remember this. And part of the reason it was so acutely part of my memory is because where this happened. Excuse me. The syringe tide. Yeah. If you've never heard of the syringe tide, buckle on up. So the syringe tide was an environmental disaster, happened in 1987 and 88 in Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York, where medical waste, including hypodermic syringes and raw garbage, washed up on the Jersey Shore, New York City, Long Island. For those of you who don't know, Connecticut, Long Island Sound, it's all right there. This forced the closing of all beaches on the Atlantic coast. Now, it's one thing to say, okay, we got medical waste, syringes, we got raw sewage, right? But add to it that we're also right in the middle of the HIV and AIDS epidemic of the 80s, which now we know at this point is not just this quote-unquote gay disease, but also drug users, particularly those who are using intravenous drugs. So now it's not just a matter of medical waste syringe. It's potentially tainted with a deadly virus. I remember this being such news and terrifying. And then you were like afraid when like the beaches were reopened that you're just going to be walking down the beach. You're going to step on a syringe. Like that was a real fear, an absolute real fear. Turns out it all came from the Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island, which, by the way, still went on after this until 2000, 2008, something like that. 2001. So it still went on for like another 12 years or whatever it is. Like ridiculous. But now it's a park. Part of the New York public park system. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, is that the place that you really want to go? Oh, the picture is disgusting. Doesn't look very inviting for a park. All right. So, the last year of the 80s, we have Mikhail Gorbachev once again, who's also acknowledged as the man of the decade. Gorbachev oversaw 1989's first free Soviet election in history before the fragmentation of the Eastern Bloc and overthrow of Soviet-dominated communist governments in Eastern Europe. That's crazy. They were the first partially free nationwide elections held in the Soviet Union and are proved to be the final national elections held as the country dissolved in 1991. You have to think about that, like the Soviet Union, the USSR, as an entity, right? And how things changed. It just became, Russia, right? What was this called? Gorbachev announced the new policy of demokratsia, which is basically democratization, except in Russian. And under this concept, the electorate would have a choice between multiple candidates per constituency, although all candidates would still have to be members of the Communist Party. It's fascinating. Well, let's see. It was... I don't get it. People's deputies of the Supreme Soviet of the Union of Soviet Social Republic. I'm not sure what that is supposed to be. I think it's trying to show party affiliation. I thought it said it had to be everyone needed to be a member of the Communist Party. But this says that there were independents. Oh, they couldn't run for the top spot unless they were part of the party. But they did have independent ministers that weren't part of it. Interesting. I thought everyone had to be. That's really fascinating and things I didn't know. So anyway, let's see. Gorbachev twice. Reagan twice, 80 and 83. Yeah, so those two guys. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Like, those two guys changed the world. Love them or hate them. Like, it's irrelevant. I mean, these were significant events that really changed, like, world political dynamics for quite some time. So I guess kudos to both of those guys, making something happen that no one thought could. And now here we are, and the world is crazy all over again. These things are cyclical. We know that, but good grief. People, let's get our shit together. So those are the Time Persons of the Year 80s edition. What do you think? Should I do the 90s? Should I do the 70s? Should I do all of them? Just do the history of mankind as like a whole little sub-series? I'd be interested to know. And if you have any advice about what to do with a depressed dog, shoot me a message. So, how do you find me? You can email me at stuckinthemiddle. Nope, that's not it. Strike that. Take 2. I'm not editing it out. You got to deal with it. You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, share, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.